Luka is a young man of about my age who has fairly recently joined the AA and is quite in the early days of his sobriety journey. He has come to AA more as a precaution that he doesn't want to end up like his father. His father was an alcoholic and he wants to sort of, which is quite common with the children of alcoholics, they want to break the cycle, is the phrase they often use. And so we decided that that's where Luka was in his journey. We don't really know his relationship to alcohol in terms of, was he particularly bad on alcohol, or was it that he became dependent on it? So I tend to just sort of go from what's in the play, and so it seems to be about that he had a dreadful father who had a dreadful relationship with alcohol. So that's where we meet Luka, and that in the first scene, we think that he's probably been to AA 2 or 3 times, but has still not found a sponsor, which is when James enters.
And I think you've probably come to some AA meetings that I've been present at, and James is a 60-something, dry, probably I would imagine 35 years. In my head, I think he's probably relapsed a couple of times, but has found his way back in and certainly been sober for a long time. Some people are able to find AA, get sober, and then leave it and steer their own path. Others become quite dependent on the structure and the discipline, and they've probably got an addictive personality on many levels, not just alcohol. And I think James has found solace in being a member of AA and going regularly. And also as a senior, dry, recovering alcoholic, you are often encouraged to become a sponsor, which is like a mentor to somebody who's joining. So I think we kind of imagined in rehearsals that James has probably been to the meetings that Luka has been to. Maybe he spotted that he needs somebody. I want to look after somebody. Or maybe somebody said, there's a guy over there, Luka. James, why don't you go introduce yourself to him and see if you could be any help? And that's kind of how we imagine the start of the play happening, isn't it?
Yeah.
The first time, I think they're probably in a room by themselves.
We had a very short window rehearsal period, like a very sort of extremely short. Normally you would have anything between 4 and 8 weeks, on average. We had 2 weeks plus then a week of tech. So we knew all we had to do, basically, all Sean and I's job was to turn up, knowing as much of the script as we could. But there's only so much you can do of that on your own. Sean and I were finding that as soon as we got up and started doing it, is that it sort of went out of your heads a bit because you'd been running it in isolation or with our partners or whatever. And because we sort of had to quick step everything, you would do a table read for about a week, like sit around and talk about all the themes. Then you would get up and try this sort of see what's happening in the scenes. Then you would do blocking. We had to do everything sort of at once. We were running before we could walk, which meant it was sort of living in a place of sort of like this could fall apart any minute.
Particularly for a 60-year-old man. One day
Not that old, Sean. You are 60, right? Yeah.
But I did used to turn to Finn and him and say, one day you'll know what it's like to be 60 and have 2 teenage children, because the brain is slightly more slow to pick up the lines. He learnt his lines incredibly quickly. I knew the lines, but then, as you said, it was having to run before you kind of jogged a bit. Yeah. And also, there's a very big difference, and I always think this whenever I'm learning any character, there's a very big difference between knowing what the line means and why you say it. And the first thing you do, the table talk bit that actors do, be it a new play or a classic play, is you work out what it all means. And then the scene and where the scene is and how the scene pivots within other scenes. And then your job as an actor, by yourself and then with the other actors and director, is to work out why you're saying things. Because of course, when you read something, you tend to assume that is the truth when you're reading it. But of course, people aren't telling the truth. And it's working out when they're telling the truth and when they're not telling the truth. Once you start reading it, the different avenues you can go down with the slight, tiny little denials. I mean, also the way it's written. There's a playwright called David Mamet, who is an amazing American playwright. And I just found out that David Ireland is a big fan of his. And I'd said to him, it's like Mamet. And he went, oh, that's interesting because I like Mamet. And the punctuation in David Mamet, or to some extent somebody like Pinter or Beckett, there is ... commas, one line, comma, something. And so the actor has to listen to the music of this thing, But in learning it quickly, you can get that wrong. There's at one point, there's a scene where I think I have 5 different ways of saying okay in one page, which is a really interesting challenge. And you've got them, we've all got them. So, you know, we all say okay, but then you can also say, okay, okay, you know, and David's play is, well, that's the skeleton of it, isn't it? And it's fascinating.
It became quite evident quite quickly, actually, you know, that a very useful way of thinking, which I think is sometimes just useful in any play to think of, but what became very useful for this was because there's 6 scenes. Because it's a two-hander, we're sort of thinking, right, who has the power in this scene? When does the power switch? Does it switch during the scene, or is it with one person for the whole thing? And it was very important for us to establish when those power shifts were, and that we both knew when they were, because we've only got ourselves, Sean and I, to rely on. That was the thing that came up quite a lot in rehearsals, where we were like, you know, Finn would think that the power shift is here, I would think it was there, Sean would think it was there, and you know, normally I think in plays you can do that, where you can all have different ideas of when certain moments are, but it became evident quite quickly that it was useful if we could all get on the same page with when those moments are, purely because David's writing is so rhythmic, and he writes crescendos, and he writes like, you know, little timp fucking drills that are, you know, building and building and building, and he writes for his words just to be spoken. And so we had to occasionally kill parts of ourselves, Sean and I, that wanted to take things in a different way or try different things out. And ultimately there is this literal script that we have to stick to.
We also didn't have time to do that if we'd wanted
Exactly, and we didn't have time, so we sort of had to fast forward through the bit even when we go, right, let's try it like this for a day. Like we didn't have time, we had to sort of try and get to the optimum thing in each scene. And so when we went through every scene, and most scenes, it's fairly clear now as to who's got the power, and it definitely changes in scenes as well as scene by scene. Number 5 in particular is very interesting for the sort of massive shift round of who has the power. One person's under the cosh and then the next person's under the cosh, and it's so enjoyable to play. And it's like the bit that you just mentioned in the last scene. It's sort of, you think it's going to go this way, but then it goes that way, and you kind of give the audience their cake and eat it as well. And it's a wonderful exercise, this play, in execution of something as well as you can. Try and execute it as well as you can and serve it as well as we can. And Sean and I, as actors, have had to shoot bits of ourselves where we'd want to subvert it, and there was points with Luka where I was sort of trying to question how intelligent he is, because I couldn't quite believe that there was guys at 30 years old that would say lines like Luka says, like pussy on tap and things like that. I'm like, none of my mates talk like that. But there are guys at 30 years old that do talk like that. And so I had to sort of work to get myself in and give myself permission to say things like that, where it wasn't just somebody that's like an alien's just landed. But sometimes I think of Luka like an alien in the first couple of scenes, like an alien that's landed. And he's like, what? Sometimes it's the easiest way for me when I get a bit caught.
I just thought of something actually that's quite interesting, that I might be wrong, it'd be for David to say, but in a way also he starts the play with giving the audience a certain tableau that is not necessarily a cliche, but it is this is my 2 little protagonists, and this is how I'm going to set them up for you. And yes, they've done a very good job of making them completely real, but they're going to give you in the first 2 scenes an enormous amount of information. And then after you've got that, they're now going to start being shifted around with other little bits of information that I throw in, albeit in a witty and subversive way that makes the play take over. That's what we discovered with I'm not saying I want to go back and have longer rehearsals, but what would have been nice is to have had an extra week where we didn't have to find that out in such a rush. Because, you know, it was tough. There was a couple of days where I didn't know where I was coming or going. And I think Finn and Jack knew that. And I, as you know, as a 60-year-old man who is a little bit of a control freak, but very open to having rehearsal periods that are long, don't mind not knowing whether I'm coming or going for a couple of days because I've got another 4 weeks to go. But I haven't. I've got 3 days, and then we've got to run it in front of the powers that be. And so
It was a baptism of fire.
I was luckily, you know, we worked really hard.
Yeah.
And you know, the play does. He writes for actors because he's also an actor. The director is not just an actor; the writer is an actor. So he's written for actors to say, and once you're on the surfboard or the skis and the boots are securely fastened, you can go down the hill.
That was always very clear from day one, from Finn's point of view, the director, that they were going to be their own thing, and also the moments in the play where David has essentially got two men talking in a room, or different rooms, which is a very, very recognisable thing, which is immediately accessible. Everybody can kind of recognise that, sitting in a cafe or whatever, even visiting someone in a hospital bed. So Finn was always very adamant that the transitions would be a place where the play is allowed to spin off into sort of complete make-believe and weird spaces, and it gets a little bit filmic. So that is also where Mills, with the set design, what she did with the set design was put this entire world in a cube and there's a lot of mirrors going on, there's moments with bunny rabbits popping up. I take the walls apart here, and there's a little story, I think, of Luka building and reshaping the world in a way that he wants it, or finding out that he can literally and figuratively break walls down and not have to stay in this room. He can come here. As well as being able to see the little sort of private moments of being in gyms. You know, gym is such a part of sort of being a young man in some ways. You see both characters in there at a certain point, and so that's a very recognisable thing. And they've just done such a wonderful job of pulling Luka, in particular Luka, through moments where everything gets a little bit more loopy and ethereal. And
I feel watching them as well, and watching them in rehearsals, and then just even when I see you step off the stage in the dance, for example, I just think it's so clever because it's the inner world of Luka that James doesn't see, but the audience see. You know, and anybody young who comes, anybody actually who's had problems with any kind of mental health or dealing with facing other people and telling them everything about themselves. We all harbour secrets. We all go to our rooms and talk to ourselves. We all have little moments that we wish we could share, but we've just got them ourselves. And I think those moments are so. I think the dance is wonderful because when I watch it, it's amusing. It's him letting go, but it's also so lonely and so. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And also quite an important reminder to remind you that you're only watching a play. It's a form of entertainment, albeit also stimulant.
yeah,
Because it's quite a heavy subject. Okay, he has got an extraordinary imagination, and you know, people do hallucinate when they're coming off drink, and there's all sorts of reasons why it's totally plausible this could happen, but within the context of the play, it's absurd and silly.
it was one of the hardest moments to sort of hone and get right was the bunny rabbit, because it is sort of so ridiculous. For Luka, it's all wrapped up in the dream that he has, where he met Jesus in his dream, and he was in Galilee, and James was there dressed as a giant bunny rabbit eating an Easter egg. It's sort of wrapped up in that, but then it's a lovely tender moment because James takes it as a sort of personal affront of, like, you know, he's too busy. I don't want to be talking, you know, this is nonsense. And you actually see Luka pretty much begging him to stay and apologising, which is a lovely, nice moment to turn on, because you don't have that yet in the play. All you have is me asking James to be his sponsor, but sort of arguing with most of what his advice is. And then at that point, he's asked for him to stay and becomes actually quite submissive for the rest of that scene and then it changes again. That's David
I think David's a huge fan of Jacobean tragedies as well, don't you? I think he loves a bit of, you know, if he could get away with it, we'd stab each other on the stage.
Yeah,
you know?
there was a sort of early draft where Luka killed him. And then Luka died as well. I can't remember how.
I never read that one.
And then we both went to heaven. There was mad versions of it. It was great. And I think what David found as the very short development process and rehearsal process went on was that it's a little bit different, this play, to what he's normally written. And that those mad explosive endings that he's had in his other plays, he said himself to me is that he realised during the process of this play that it's a lot more sort of complex, this play, and actually you do start to feel for both of them at different points, and that a mad, mental, violent ending didn't feel right. It's irrelevant that Luka tells him that he slept with his son to a certain extent, in my opinion, and what it is that he tells him something, I tell him that something that his son would never tell him, doesn't feel comfortable telling him, because he obviously looks at his dad and does think of him as a dinosaur and does think he'll be disappointed in him. And it's almost the worst thing to say to James. I think it's wrapped up in homophobia, but I don't think it's because his son is gay. We've said this, is that actually if James's son had turned around to him and said, Dad, look, I need a word. Look, I think I'm gay. I think I might be gay. I am gay, whatever. I think James would be still a bit, that sort of repressed part of him would be a bit shocked by the fact of having a gay son, but I don't think he would react in a particularly negative way, overtly negative way, because he'd come to him, and that's where I think James is very self-obsessed, in my opinion, very self-obsessed person, very vain, and I think that's the ultimate delivery of his vanity, is to be the shoulder to cry on, is what he likes to be. And Luka takes that away from him, right at the very end. And the sort of violence, it's almost the most violent thing that can happen without smacking him in the face. And then the words that come tumbling out of James's mouth in that moment are some of the most vile things you can say to a human being that's struggling, a human being that's openly said that he's thought about killing himself. James tells him to go hang himself. And I think the homophobic sentiment that's in James comes out, the violent sentiment comes out, his anger, his frustration, and it all just pours out of him. And he says the most horrible stuff to Luka. And I think Luka can't quite believe that he has another older man like his father in his life. Betraying him and letting him down and telling him that he's a piece of shit. And I think then Luka, it comes spilling out of Luka, because he said he's built up a few resentments during the play. You know, he's ruined his fifth step for him and all this kind of stuff. And I actually think it's the moments, is to think of this play in moments, and that human beings can react and say things in the heat of the moment that they don't necessarily mean, but all they want to do is hurt someone. So they'll say the worst thing they can say. And that's why I love the way the ending is that they both just let stuff out, and there'd be a world where they could then talk about it. But then the magic tragedy of it is that he dies. And it's left unresolved.
I think all that is absolutely valid. And then to add on top of that, what goes on in my head is that I think that I've worked on that James has got a trigger point. He's got a trigger switch that fliches. How I've used that myself, in as much as, again, as a parent, I can see that trigger of people pushing you, and you know, and being a parent is by far the most difficult thing I've ever had to do in my life. And so I use some of that as a sort of thing to make me think, what is it? Is James a control freak? Yes. Am I a control freak, Sean? Yes, we all are, but I'm not James. So I then accelerated my own memory of how I reacted to things into a place where I think James would be. And that means, by a trigger point, means I think he has flashes of, and it's all about, even though he doesn't think it, it's all about controlling everything. Probably, if he went to a therapist, somebody would help him say, this is all to do with the trauma of your childhood. And whatever you witnessed above you, or the church even, because, you know, there are touches of whether I was sexually abused at church, or whatever trauma he went through, that he has buried and thought, I'll put everything in boxes. And I know that if I can do this box, I can cope with it. And so I think, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I think that's what James does. And he pops the box. He's the jack in the box. So it's not about him, he is homophobic without a doubt. Mm-hmm. But you know, he genuinely thinks he does like gay people. And he genuinely thinks gay people are having a great time. And I think you're right. In the right frame of mind, had he had a decent relationship with his son, maybe he would have come to terms with the son being gay and grown himself into realising he's as valuable a human being as anybody else as long as he's happy. But because he's a control freak, he has that taken away from him, and that leads to the trigger point. That they want to go to the theatre again and see something else and be in a room sharing it with other people and the magic that that is.
And I think this play specifically, it's important for people to take away that in essence is talk to people. Whatever you're going through, there is someone somewhere that you can talk to, whether that is friends, family. If you don't even have that, there's organisations, there's brilliant people. So whatever it is that you're feeling, and also whatever it is you're feeling, there's always going to be somebody that you're not going to shock, you know? And those friends that you have, family members or people you know at work or organisations or whatever that you know, that it's a very important thing to have someone in your life that isn't fazed by anything you say. And you can't shock them. Hold on to those people like you'd hold on to your own children or gold or whatever, because they are worth their weight. I have one or two in my life, and you can't shock them. And that's what David's plays do very well, is teach a sort of lesson in against prudes and against people who, no, we don't talk about that kind of stuff. We don't talk about it, which is so stupid and dangerous. It's dangerous not to let somebody say things, because if they don't say things, they will do things. So, talk.